I was fresh out of college, traveling cross-country to visit an old friend. My car had broken down, and with no cell service, my only option was to hitchhike. It was a rural area, and the sun was beginning to set when a pickup truck finally pulled over. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, introduced himself as Bill. He seemed friendly enough and reassured me that he was heading in the same direction. I climbed into the truck, relieved to be on my way. We chatted for a while about various topics, and I thought Bill was just an eccentric but good-hearted guy. As night fell, the conversation took a turn. He started talking about his job in construction and mentioned that he sometimes worked alone at night. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, and the only other light was from the occasional farmhouse we passed. The landscape seemed endless and desolate. My unease grew when Bill took a route that seemed increasingly remote. Eventually, he pulled over under a large tree. "Just need to make a quick stop," he said, but his tone was different, harsher, almost mechanical. I watched as he opened the truck's back and rummaged through it. "Do you want to come and help me with something?" he called out. My instincts were screaming that something was off, but I was too frightened to refuse. I stepped out of the truck, and he led me to the back. As I approached, I saw that the truck bed was filled with tools and equipment, but what caught my eye were several heavy-duty ropes and a large container of something I couldn't quite identify. Bill noticed my gaze. "Just old stuff I need to clean up," he said, though the way he said it made me shiver. His demeanor had become increasingly unsettling. I was about to ask if we could leave when he suddenly grabbed my arm with a vice-like grip. "I think you've been too friendly with me," he said, his voice low and menacing. My heart pounded as I tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip. With a surge of adrenaline, I kicked him and broke free. I ran back to the front of the truck and jumped inside, locking the doors. Bill banged on the windows and shouted, but I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I drove away as fast as I could, eventually finding a service station where I could call for help. The police were notified, but Bill was never found. Looking back, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly horrifying. I never hitchhiked again. I've always been a bit of a thrill seeker, and hitchhiking has been my preferred method of adventure. I've had my fair share of odd rides, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened one chilly autumn evening. It was getting late, and the highway I was on seemed eerily empty. I'd been waiting for a ride for almost an hour, and my fingers were numb from the cold. Just as I began to lose hope, a beat-up old sedan pulled over. The driver's face was hidden in shadow. The interior light was broken, and I couldn't see much more than the silhouette of a man behind the wheel. "Need a lift?" His voice crackled through the open window. I hesitated for a moment, but then, seeing no other option, I climbed in. The air inside the car was stale, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I asked him where he was headed, and he mumbled something about going to a town up ahead. As we drove, the conversation was minimal. The driver kept his eyes on the road, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional creak from the old car. I started to get uneasy. There was something off about him. Every so often he would glance at me in the rearview mirror, but his expression remained unreadable. About halfway through the ride, we hit a patch of fog that rolled in thick and fast. The visibility dropped drastically. The driver didn't seem fazed. He just kept going at a steady pace. I could barely make out the road ahead, and the fog made the darkness even more oppressive. In the middle of the fog, the car suddenly swerved. I gripped the seat, heart racing. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel, and he mumbled something under his breath. I couldn't tell if he was talking to me or himself. Panic began to set in, and I tried to peer through the fog to see if there was any sign of where we were. Then, just as suddenly as the swerve, the car came to a halt. The driver turned to me, and for the first time I saw his face clearly. His eyes were cold and devoid of any warmth. He said, "I need you to get out." Confused and scared, I protested, but he cut me off. "Now!" I had no choice but to comply. I stepped out into the thick fog, barely able to see anything around me. As I watched the car drive away, my breath visible in the cold air, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no idea where I was. Hours later, after wandering through the fog and finally stumbling upon a farmhouse, I managed to call for help. It turned out I was quite far from the nearest town. The police were called, but the driver was never found. To this day, I wonder why he let me go, and what might have happened if I had stayed longer in that car. It was late summer, and I was traveling through a desolate stretch of highway. My car had overheated and I was stranded without a working phone. A passing car finally stopped, and the driver, a young man who looked to be in his late 20s, offered me a ride. His name was Jake, and he seemed friendly enough, though he had an odd, restless energy about him. He talked animatedly about his life and seemed genuinely interested in my predicament, offering to help me get to the nearest town. As we drove, Jake's conversation grew increasingly erratic. He began sharing strange stories about his past, tales of moving from city to city and always running from something he never quite specified. His stories had a dark undertone, but I tried to stay engaged, thinking it was just nervous chatter. The sky darkened, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly. The conversation turned to more unsettling topics, such as his fear of being followed and how he had to keep moving to avoid bad people. My unease grew with each mile. When we finally reached a remote rundown motel, Jake suggested we stop for a drink. I hesitated but agreed, thinking it would be safer than continuing in the dark. As we entered the dingy motel lobby, Jake's demeanor changed again. He became colder, more distant, and kept glancing around as if he were expecting someone to burst in. Jake insisted I stay at the motel for the night, offering to pay for a room. I was wary but accepted, thinking it was the safest option at the time. As I walked to my room, I saw Jake pacing outside the motel office. His behavior was erratic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud banging on my door. My heart raced as I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. The banging continued, growing more frantic. I grabbed a chair to brace the door and called the front desk, but there was no answer. Finally, the noise stopped. Exhausted and terrified, I managed to fall asleep. In the morning, I found the motel lobby deserted and the front desk locked up. I left as quickly as I could, finding my way to a nearby town where I could call for help. It turned out the motel was abandoned, and no one had stayed there for months. I never learned who Jake was or what his intentions were, but the incident left me shaken. I realized how easily things could have turned out much worse.